Welcome to Obligations. I'm Professor Nadia Netzel, and I hope you'll enjoy the course. We'll be moving quickly. In this lesson, you're going to learn what an obligation is, its definition, its sources, its effects, and the importance of understanding the differences between the different sources of obligations. So, an obligation, according to Article 1756, is a legal relationship whereby a person called the obligor is bound to render a performance in favor of the other person called an obligee. Performance may consist of giving, doing, or not doing. So an obligation is a legal requirement. It's something that you are legally obligated to do. If you're the one who's legally obligated, you're the obligor. If you're the one who's getting the benefit of this obligation, then you are the obligee. Okay? Sources of obligations can be contracts and other expressions of juridical will. Okay? So you can agree to take on a legal obligation, but they can also arise, quote, directly from the law, regardless of the declaration of will. This is from Article 1757. So what does that mean? Oh gosh, I just ran into your car. I rear-ended you. I'm now an obligor. Right. I owe you a legal obligation. I have to fix your car because it was my fault that you now have a dent in the rear of your car. And that makes you an obligee. So obligations arise from everything from actually an intentional tort to a contract, okay? And everything in between. An unintentional tort, my backing into your car, something like a management of affairs of another. If I'm a busybody and I see that your window's broken and you're not home, I call up the boarding up company. I'm now taking on an obligation that I need to be reasonable about taking care of your stuff. All the way to, oops, I just obligated myself with a contract. In fact, I didn't mean to do that, but now I have to pay for it. All the way to, yes, I hereby absolutely agree that I want to be legally, contractually obligated to do this, and in exchange you'll do that. Okay? So that is essentially an obligation. And as you can see, the scope under Louisiana law is very, very broad. Now, in this course, however, we're only going to be dealing with the midterm from obligations that arise essentially by an act of will, but that are not tort related. So torts becomes another course, but there isn't the kind of dichotomy that you see in common law. Oh, that can't possibly be contract. No, we see them as a continuum. But in this course, we're going to be focusing on contracts and other obligations that sort of arise from your willingness, your juridical will. Okay. We're going to focus, to begin with, on obligations in general. And then, just for a short period of time, we're just taking the first section of this obligation. This is Articles 1756 to 1759. Then we're going to go through contracts, call them conventional obligations, but contracts is another normal term. And then we'll come back to obligations in general and cover them a little bit more. So we'll be starting with a little bit of background, then we're going to things that are more familiar but more into detail, and then we'll be coming back to obligations in general. Obligations in general, these are principles that apply to all kinds of obligations. So sources of obligations, we talked about 1757, 1758. What are the effects of an obligation? Well, if you're the obligee, then you have the right to enforce the obligation, to enforce performance at the obligor's expense if he doesn't actually perform on his own. Or you can recover damages if, again, he fails to perform. If you're the obligor, then you have a right to be discharged once you've performed, or if the obligation has been extinguished or modified, then you can or you have a defense, you can contest the obligee's actions. Okay, so that's 1758. So essentially what 1758 is saying is that as an obligee, you have a right to legal remedy. As an obligor, you have a right to a legal defense if it comes to that. Okay. Finally, Article 1759. Now, you learned in contracts that once a contract arises, there's a duty of good faith. But in civil law, there's a duty of good faith with regard to any obligation, whether it arises from tort or contract or anything in between. Okay? So good faith governs the conduct of the obligor and the obligee in whatever pertains to the obligation. Okay? So anything you do, you must do in good faith. This seems much broader than what you're used to at common law, but because of other common law remedies, it's pretty similar in scope between common law and civil law. They use sort of different language, but get to the same place eventually. And because we're Louisiana, we are not actually pure civil law. We've incorporated a lot of common law ideas. Okay, so now that you understand that an obligation is a legal requirement, it's a legal relationship whereby one person has to perform for the benefit of another person or persons, and what the effects of that are and what the sources of that are. Let's go back to sources for a minute. There's a case you're going to be reading, Harrison versus Gore, in which you'll see some of the differences because, as you might expect, Louisiana Civil Code provides different remedies, different effects, depending on whether you're complaining about a tort or whether you're trying to enforce a contract. And so Harrison versus Gore gives you an interesting discussion and explains to you, I want you to think about as you read it, why is it important whether the plaintiff filed suit for contract as opposed to tort, and why did she do that? Okay, so enjoy, and I hope you enjoyed this section of the course. Until later.